the idea for the unMonastery, as referred to as the unMonastery, has now been going for 16 months. It came about in a session at the first unconference in Strasbourg, and it was a room of about 30 people who came together with the realization that in order to continue to do the work that they were doing and not burn out and not become alienated, there was the need to build a strong foundation, or what I've referred to as an infrastructure on which to do that work. Because although people refer to things like the sharing economy as a great like evolution or paradigm shift or whatever, despite how great we may think this is and our experiences with it, it doesn't really cut the mustard when it comes to actually feeding yourself and paying rent and stuff like that. So the unMonastery evolved out of that conversation of like, well, we need a physical space because none of us really use that much money. Funding isn't necessarily needed for a lot of the stuff that we execute on because it's skill-based, it's code-based, the tools are normally free, and if they're not free, we can probably build them. What we do struggle with is having property and space in which to do those things. So that was the kind of natural conversation that evolved that led to let's start a set of spaces. The reason why we adopted the name unMonastery is because we wanted to create a space that doesn't necessarily have a fixed purpose, but is kind of multi-use. So when we thought about the different kinds of spaces that have existed throughout history, we thought about the monastery because of the way they never really had this fixed purpose, that they would brew beer, there was scripture, there was prayer and worship, there was a completely different set of actions that were executed in these spaces, which seemed to mirror the way in which we wanted to construct a new space. And we looked to other existing structures, such as hackerspaces, and thought there was something incredibly useful and powerful in those kinds of structures, and particularly their spread. But one of the things we struggled with is that hackerspaces don't necessarily have a civic or social contract with the communities in which they're based, and generally serve the individuals, whether it be hobbies or personal projects and things like that. So the monastery seemed like an interesting model because it had this same kind of silo approach that hackerspaces have, but also has this kind of social contract and interaction with its community. Since coining that term as a group, actually, if you begin to look at what the monasteries were doing in the early 7th and 8th century, you begin to realize that maybe the name should have been re-monastery, because the contribution that monks and monastic life made to communities in terms of building the infrastructure and things like that is actually a lot of what we're attempting to do. So after the first conference, the idea did stick, but we didn't really get very far in its development. And we continued to have conversations and write documents and try and think how do we get something like this off the ground? And it wasn't until the second conference in December of last year that we all sat down and were like, okay, of all the things that we've spoken about, this is the project we're the most committed to. And in the space of 3 days, we worked together to formalize some of the structure of what the space might look like. We mined the kind of metaphor of the monastery and begun to think about, well, what would monastic principles look like in this sense? And built the website, created the logo, put out an initial call for applications that asked quite a lot of complex and difficult questions of anybody that would want to apply, because we saw this as a real pledge of commitment. 5 or 6 edge riders came forward and said, yes, I would fully commit to this project were you to establish it somewhere. And coupled with that, you have Alberto Kotica, who is one of the founding members of Edge Riders, and he was working with Matera 2019 in the City of Culture bid. And it was only in this context that we had the opportunity to offer this as a potential model, and Matera was interested and said yes. And so that's kind of, in terms of necessity of realising the project, how we end up in Matera. But I think it's really important to understand that, particularly when I came here for the first time, that it's an incredible place that one can't describe to other people, and the generosity and way in which the community here has interacted with us makes it seem like it almost couldn't start in any other place. Edgeriders originally developed within a policy context, so the unMonastery does have a policy slant, but is much more focused on constructing a model that can create meaning and can create a safe space in which to articulate that meaning. But in the present moment, there are a set of problems that the unMonastery has kind of been constructed to solve by combining them. So the three primary issues that the unMonastery is focused on is high unemployment, particularly on the part of skilled people graduating from university, a massive amount of unused housing stock and commercial stock throughout Europe, and with the onset of austerity, you see the rolling back of state service provision and the need to plug that gap if we're to continue. And then there's two other things that are less primary, but that's brain drain from small towns and cities to capital cities. There's the desire to roll that back in some way, and unMonastery is very firmly a model that can only be used in the context of small towns and cities and never be placed within a capital city because it's just not appropriate. And the last thing is there's a particular focus on creating resilient processes, infrastructure and ways of working that can be sustainable in the event of future and existing crisis. So I think that those things are really fundamental to what the unMonastery is. The unMonastery project has been quite a heavy thing to carry because there hasn't been any money involved. Edgeriders is already quite a precarious distributed network of people. At the second conference, when we really knew that we were going to do it, I stepped forward and said that I would facilitate and administrate the project, but that would not mean that I was in any way its sole owner or that I would get to make specific decisions, and I've tried to extricate myself as much as possible from that process. So this is probably the first real opportunity since that moment to come together again as a community and to feed in all of the things that we've been thinking and roughly sketching out online since that conference in December of last year, and really solidify what the challenges are, punch holes in the existing model, and figure out how we can make something like this effective in 4 months, because it is only really a prototype. So there's quite a lot of stuff to build and construct and agree on before we actually turn up here in February. So the things going forward is establishing clearer roles for the people that have stepped forward to be involved in the project, to accept a series of applications that have been made that meet the criteria of challenges that exist within Matera. And I think also what has arisen out of the last 24 hours is the need to keep this building alive between now and February. So there's a stack of other things that need doing, but I would say that's probably the list of priorities.